of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, I want to welcome you to our third CARE panel of the spring semester. The Center for Ethics and Human Values CARE program is funded by the Office of Research with support from the OSUMC Center for Bioethics and the College of Public Health. And I'm Dana Howard. I'm faculty in the Center for Bioethics and Philosophy, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel. And I also want to thank Lillian Perkins, who does a lot of the background for all of this organizational stuff. So thank you very much, Lily, for all of your hard work. So today we're going to be talking about something that I think is in a lot of people's minds. And it's something that we all face when conducting research. And it's sometimes hard to see how to navigate our way out of it and how regulatory oversight can really help us meet these challenges. So we're going to be talking about power dynamics in research. Relationships between researchers and participants are often marked by deep power imbalances. And rather than try to avoid power dynamics, researchers have to learn how to address them in equitable ways. And so what our panel is going to be discussing is how they have navigated the research process to engage participants in treating them as equal partners, and how as researchers we can work towards our research aims and our output being both meaningful for participants, but also generalizable for the research community at large. And I'm so excited about our panel today. So we have Professor Rosanne Liu, who is assistant professor in the Department of Education Studies at Wesleyan University. Rosanne is an anthropologist of education who is currently working on a book about structural racism and school funding. And additionally, she has written recently about these topics, about how researchers navigate collaborative research endeavors, where there may be disagreements between partners about critical aspects of the findings. We also have Professor Ayaz Hyder, who is an assistant professor in the Division of Environmental Health Studies and core faculty in the Translational Data Analytics Institute. He's a public health researcher in data analytics with longstanding interest in developing community-centered modeling, where the models are co-created, personalized, and relevant to the community needs. And we also have Dr. Jodi Ford, who is associate professor in the College of Nursing and is the director of the Stress Science Lab at OSU. And Jodi has expertise in primary collection of survey and stress biomarker data with adolescents and young adults, including vulnerable and hard-to-reach populations. Her research often involves the collection of biological specimens to measure physiological stress, which can create concerns for participants over how we may use their specimens. And she has written about the ethical and feasibility considerations of such research. So I'm so excited to have all of you here. We're going to be starting with our outside expert, Rosanne, and Rosanne is going to give you an overview of how she's been thinking about these issues, how these challenges have sort of affected her understanding of her methodology for the first 15 to 20 minutes. For the first 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'll have responses from Jodi and Ayaz, who will sort of give their own experiences and perspectives coming from their diverse fields of research. I have set a set of questions that I'm going to ask to get the ball rolling, but again, it's always like the audience questions are super important to this conversation, and you all come from different perspectives, and we'd love to sort of hear where you're coming from. So to no further ado, I'll let Rosanne take the floor first.
Thank you so much, Dana. So I would just want to extend a big thank you to you for inviting me to this panel and for just giving me the opportunity to sustain my thinking around these issues of research and ethics, and Lillian Perkins for setting up the Zoom logistics. So as you had said, I was asked to talk for about 15 minutes or so about the distinct challenges that comes with navigating some of these power relationships. So I'm going to take 12 minutes and leave a little bit more time for Q&A. And I thought we could kind of ease our way into this discussion by having me say a little bit about my orientation to ethnographic research, which is in many ways related to my personal experience. So let me share screen with you. Okay. Can everybody see that? Is there a thumbs up? Okay, perfect. Hold on just a second. Okay, here we go. So when I was 22, I witnessed firsthand what Donna Haraway refers to as the power to see while not being seen. I was in a huge 100-person lecture class on education law, and we're talking about the students in some of the magnet high schools in New York City, which is a topic that continues to provoke a lot of lively debate today. So there was a teacher from the premier magnet high school, Stuyvesant, who spoke up, and though I don't remember exactly what her point was, I still remember three things about what she said. First, she painted a picture of Asian American students in magnet high schools as coming from impoverished backgrounds. And she talked about how these kids' parents worked in sweatshops or restaurants, but still managed to succeed academically. And second, she spoke with great authority, for she herself was a teacher at the school. And third of all, I remember how it made me feel. So my brother had attended Stuyvesant High School. I went to Bronx Science, and our dad had worked as a chef in Chinatown for much of our childhood. But I wasn't embarrassed because of those facts at all. And in fact, I'd always been very proud of my dad's job as a chef and believed it was my birthright to eat good food and to eat well. But instead, I was embarrassed by how she saw us as one-dimensional people who were to be pitied or held up as shining examples. Moreover, the picture she drew seemed so incomplete. So for every kid I knew whose parent did work in the garment or restaurant industry, there was a kid whose parents owned a window manufacturing company or was a real estate agent. So many years later, when I began studying anthropology as a doctoral student and learned of the discipline's fraught institutional history and role in colonialism, it was that experience in the 100-person lecture class that gave me a grounded and visceral understanding of the politics of field work and the ethics of representing people's lives and producing ethnographies. I knew what it felt like to be rendered in a way that, though not factually incorrect, didn't resonate and felt embarrassing. I knew what it was like to be talked about by someone with authority, someone who spent nearly every day with teenagers like me, but didn't see us. So when I read Writing Against Culture, let me just give a little bit of background. Writing Against Culture is an anthropological piece that was this watershed moment in anthropology. It was written by a Palestinian American anthropologist, Laila Abu Lugad, who challenged the way in which anthropologists, through their representations, contributed to the othering of non-white people. And so when I read Writing Against Culture for the first time, I understood the arguments in a personal way, because I knew how it felt to have an authoritative voice represent me as a monolith, to thingify me, even if the representation was, quote unquote, a positive one. We were all high-achieving model minority students to that teacher. In 1975, Toni Morrison gave a stunningly honest talk at Portland State University and took academia to task for its complicity or active leadership in the project of racialization. Pointedly critiquing those disciplines, including anthropology, Morrison said, "Anthropology is the study of the colored peoples of the world. They don't study anybody else. Social studies itself was founded and funded by the Mellons and Carnegies, and those people were interested in the deviates who were not like them. It got its first money from those people, and they never studied themselves. Urban studies is the study of Black people, and the approach vigorously held to in these studies, Blacks as wards of the state, never as its pioneers. It does take two to hold a chain, the chained and the chainer. And it takes two to make anthropology, the student and the studied. And though no group has spent more money on it to have its genetics examined, its fecundity stopped, its intelligence measured, cross-acculturation is consistently neglected. And I would like to know, who are these people who know our sperm count, but they don't know our names? So it requires really no analysis to understand that for Morrison, the relationship between a student of anthropology and those who are studied parallels the oppressive relationship between the chained and the chainer. My very first encounter with anthropology in college was very different from what Morrison described, though. I took a post-colonial studies course about the Philippines, and the sharpest and most incisive comments in class came from a Filipina anthropology student who had situated her cultural critiques within a broader understanding of global phenomena. I was curious about this discipline that gave students an expansive and yet precise way of talking about their own worlds. And so when I started studying education and anthropology in grad school, it was with faculty of color who, to one extent or another, had some skin in the game. And because of those experiences, anthropology was, to me, a way to understand our own lived conditions better and to answer questions for me about the school systems that I've been through, questions about educational inequality, and questions that, quite frankly, were not very much of interest to anthropology proper. In that way, I entered the anthropology of education a bit askew, which made me quite open to the idea of engaged anthropology, more specifically, that aspect of engaged anthropology that Charles Hale refers to as activist research. He defines activist research as research that, quote, allows dialogue with collaborators to shape each phase of the process, from conception of the research project to data collection, to verification and dissemination of the results. And so it's important to note that he differentiates activist research from what he calls cultural critique, which he says is an approach to research and writing in which political alignment is manifested through the content of the knowledge produced and not necessarily through the relationship established with an organized group in struggle. So I felt that most anthropologists of education did cultural critique, but less were able to do activist research, but because it required more time, more relationship building, and a willingness to seek control. And having experienced what it was like to be represented in a flat and two-dimensional way, I was committed to being an anthropologist of education, if not activist researcher for my dissertation study. But as I detailed more extensively in the article that this talk is based off of, I approached it all rather naively. I thought it mostly meant getting feedback from your research participants along the way and being earnest about incorporating their ideas. And it was that, but there were also a number of things that I didn't anticipate and mistakes I made along the way that led to a truly tense ethnographic standoff between me and my research participants in the study. So all that about my background, my commitments is just to, make my first point, which is that good intentions don't always carry the day when it comes to research ethics. So let me try to give a really brief summary of the conflict over ethnographic representation that I encountered during my dissertation research. So my dissertation research took place in a social justice charter school that engaged in this very delicate balancing act in its attempt to reflect the cultural heritages of its students, 70% of whom were Asian American and 20% of whom were Black. And the dissertation was rhetorically framed around the question, does the school's emphasis on Asian American cultural practices marginalize the school's Black students? So this was a question that I had co-constructed with the principal, who was invested in understanding the experiences of Black students in the school, because as she told me, I know the Asian students in the school are getting a lot out of being here, but I wonder how the Black students feel. So despite seeking out the principal and gathering her input in various stages of the ethnographic process, the board members felt incredibly threatened by the question and subsequently accused me of being unethical in my approach. And I wanted to foreground the perspectives of the Black moms I spoke to, who, though they really appreciated the school in a lot of ways, also felt like there was more to be done. One of them said, I definitely feel respected, and I think our culture is reflected. Is it as reflected as I would like it to be? Personally, no. The board members, however, wanted me to change the research question and focus my attention on the experiences of Asian Americans, of Asian American families. And though some part of me felt that being an activist researcher obligated me in some ways to take the board members' suggestions seriously, I ended up rejecting both of those suggestions. Though I didn't know it at the time, my political alignment in the field was shifting, and I began to feel more committed to foregrounding the concerns of Black moms so that these perspectives didn't get completely buried under the many glowing reviews of the school. The dilemma of who an engaged ethnographer aligns with when there are competing perspectives highlights how conceptions of accountability and participatory research endeavors requires a finer grained understanding of the multiplicitous groups that exist within the community. And as Hale cautions us, an organized group in struggle, be it a community, an organization, a movement, or people, never has the transparency that the phrase organized group implies. There are always factions, power disputes, and internal hierarchies, both long-term and conjunctural. These require analysis, understanding, and reasoned assessment as part of the very process of alignment. So I had assumed the coherence of the school community and hadn't conducted a more thorough analysis of what Hale calls the factions, power disputes, and internal hierarchies. And if I had done so, I might have realized one very important thing early on, which is that our alignments and obligations change during the research process. Christopher Loperena writes, quote, "The ways in which our alignments are continuously figured throughout the research process puts us at odds with other community members." So if I can distill the experience to one big takeaway, it's this point about the shifting nature of political alignments in the ethnographic process that was really hit home for me. So I held a rather static view of political alignment until I was forced to choose. Though I'd actively solicited the feedback of school leaders and board members because they were the gatekeepers of the institution, it wasn't until they took issue with some of the quotes that I included did the different political currents and competing senses of responsibility emerge. It was then that my responsibility to the school's Black families became clearer to me. And by that point, I'd already been banned from the school, and a lot of the students that I spoke to had graduated. And yet I felt a responsibility to represent their perspectives as best I could. So I want to just end this intro with my big lesson, which was, I think having a better understanding that activist research often requires a reconfiguration of political alignments can help ethnographers navigate a highly politicized landscape with more finesse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roseann. Maybe next we'll hear from Ayaz, and then after that, we'll hear from Jodi.
That's good. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to Dana and Lillian for organizing this. I think, like Roseann, I'm gonna talk about my background in terms of what drives my attitudes about power and how why I care about power in the kind of research that I do. Then I'm gonna give you some examples of current work where that is manifesting, where why I care about power is manifesting, and then end with some thoughts on how I'm thinking about the future of the role of power in the research that I do. So in terms of background, I am intersection of multiple things. I'm the son of an immigrant parent who are from Pakistan. I had a middle income upbringing. I am Muslim. I am a father of 4. We had kids during grad school and worked throughout grad school. So I had multiple jobs in addition to going to grad school, and I've been a community organizer. I had no formal training. I never had formal training in community engaged research, but what I did have a lot of is extensive training in computational epidemiology and doing various types of analytics. And so what really empowered me to think about community engaged research and then down the road about the role of power was coming to Ohio State, actually, being hired through the Translational Data Analytics Initiative, and learning about what the land grant mission of Ohio State looks like. And over the years since I've been here, and since 2015, I have struggled to define what community engagement looks like for someone doing data analytics in public health. But I think, as some of my current experiences might highlight, I'm trying to figure that out. So in terms of current work, power dynamics have played a central role in both research work and service work that I've been fortunate to be able to do. So I'll give you an example from research. So one of the methodologies that I use is called group-based group model building workshops. And this is a methodology that comes from, in different disciplines call it different things, but it essentially comes from community-based system dynamics, which is a discipline within system dynamics that Peter Hoffman, who is now at the Case Western up in Cincinnati, up in Cleveland, has really shown many examples of and worked on for past several years. So one of the things you have to do in group-based in group model building workshops is recruit participants. And one of the things that we didn't do very well in one project was that we didn't have a local champion. And so what that meant was, as we were doing these workshops over a period of about 2.5 years, we had to learn how to manage, learn about what the power dynamics were, and learn how to manage those power dynamics within that group in real time. And that led to a couple of issues, but then we were able to resolve them, I think, in that work. And so my takeaway from that work was I need to learn how to do this better. In terms of service work, a lot of the work I've been doing in the past 2 years has been working with decision makers such as school superintendents and public health leaders who are making decisions based on data. And my takeaway from that is that data equals power. But the problem is that uncertainty in data leads to uncertainty in the decision making and uncertainty in who has the power to make what decisions. And so much of my work is now trying to think about the role of power in doing translational data analytics work down the road. In terms of the future, while I've been learning and thinking about a lot of different topics, one concept that I've recently learned about is this concept of anti-domination. And it comes from a podcast that I've been listening to, and I'll put the link in the chat a little bit later. But it talks about how anti-domination is a way that it's a concept that seeks to secure the conditions in which people enjoy substantive equal freedom as opposed to formal equal freedom. So this is a direct quote from that podcast by the author. And the example, to kind of make it a bit more clear, is, imagine being pulled over for a speeding ticket. So while the fine might be $150 for that person, which is a formal, right? It's a formal equality. Everybody who gets pulled over gets a $150 fine, but a rich person versus a poor person is affected differently based on what that fine is. So while we have this formal equality, we have this substantive equality that is non-existent because of that, the effect of wealth on those two people. Now, applying that to data equals power, what are some of the open questions are then what are the ways by which we as a society can create the conditions where access to and use of data for decision making is substantively equal rather than just formally equal. So for example, if we make data publicly available, right, or through a dashboard or whatnot, it's not enough because there are still disparities that exist in access to that data, rules that might prevent the acting on that data to keep populations healthy and safe, such as Senate Bill 22 here in Ohio, or the prevalence of misinformation that might corrupt the ways that those decisions are being made using that data. And so in modeling, and to kind of add to the great quote from Toni Morrison that Roseann shared, there's the model and there's the modeled, right? So we're modeling communities and how things are happening. And so if you think about in the context of COVID-19, many of our models do not take into account many of the things that our communities care about. And so there's a famous quote by George Box that, and I'll end with this, that if all models are wrong and only some models are useful, then my addendum to that is, then why don't we ask communities, which models are useful, right? And so I think that is what I struggle with as I think about power, and that's going to be driving some of the work that I do in the future in various areas. So that's my introduction, and thank you for the opportunity again.
Great, thank you. I'll go ahead and speak next. I really appreciate as well being asked to participate and listening to Roseann and Ayaz and their expertise. I'm actually learning quite a bit myself, and it's a great time to reflect, I think, on all the work that we are doing. Much of my work focuses on adolescents and young adults and looking at how adversity experiences across the early childhood and adolescence has an impact on primarily mental health, depression, and anxiety, suicide behaviors. And an area that I'm very interested in is how does this adversity affect stress in its biological, kind of physiological stress processes as the pathway through which how the social experiences shape mental health. And so through much of this work is a lot of it is collecting biomarkers of stress through a variety of mechanisms, hair, saliva, blood. And as one could expect, that can lead people to have some concerns over what we might be doing as researchers with the biomarkers that we're collecting based on some historical and unfortunately, I'm sure still to this day, of people misusing data that they collect. And much of the work, and kind of as an example as well, that I'm doing right now is a project with youth who are experiencing homelessness. So I'm on a grant with Natasha Slesnik and Kelly Kelleher, who are the multiple principal investigators, where we are testing a housing intervention, a housing first intervention with the youth. And all the youth are getting some intensive social services, and half the sample are getting housing for 6 months. And as part of the study, we're actually also testing stress pathways through which how the intervention may be impacting health and well-being. I've also engaged as well my own data collection with youth who are experiencing homelessness and engage with them in collecting biomarkers. And some things that I feel that with this group, of course, with all adolescents, they have some vulnerability given their age and having parents being the ones. Of course, we ask assent and consent, but there could certainly be, power with parents kind of potentially even coercing youth to engage in some additional research for additional incentive money. But the youth that we work with are on the streets and accompanied by an adult on the streets alone. And many, as you can imagine, have a significant trauma history prior to leaving the home setting, as well as on the streets. There's a significant amount of fear and mistrust of researchers. Some is just concern over being judged because of the experience of where they're at, of the experience of being homelessness. Many also have, as well, concerns about how we may be using the data that we're going to be collecting with them. Concerns that we might be collecting the data and using it for collecting DNA to potentially impact them with criminal behaviors. And so that causes quite a bit of clearly stress. And so one of the things, I'm very fortunate to have been involved in learning from Natasha Slesnik. She's engaged in this work for decades and has established where much of the research we do is at the Star House, which is a drop-in shelter for youth experiencing homelessness. but have learned quite a bit about her approach with these youth, and really trying to adapt like a trauma-informed approach to research. And that's really an approach that's been applied much to healthcare settings, and is more being discussed in the literature about applying it as well to research and data collection. And some of the tenets of that are really focusing on safety of the research participants so that they feel safe, trustworthiness and transparency, in collaboration and mutuality, that they're part of the process, empowering them, giving them voice and choice, and also focusing on cultural, historical, and gender issues. Many of these youth have intersectional identities as well, and have experienced discrimination along those identities as well. Some of the things that I have seen for myself in this work, challenges are, some of them are also institutional based, in thinking about how we incentivize our participants, because these youth are homeless. Often there's concerns that we would give them too much money, that they'll be using the money for drugs and not using it appropriately. So how we give them their incentive, if it's cash versus a store gift card, and unfortunately many of them get a store gift card and they sell it for cash because they may need it for something else besides what we're determining that they need it for, and giving them a gift card to food instead. And then as well as how much money we give them. So we collected this data, similar data, in a large community sample of housed adolescents, and the amount of money that has been debated about what they get versus what we might give to youth who are on the street is different, again, because there's concern over what they may be using the money for. There's no difference in their participation. They're all giving the same thing to us. And as far as what we're asking and the amount of money, of course, it should not be coercive, but if there needs to be some fair and equal representation of how we're doing that. And then the last aspect is really also to consent for those who are minors. So pretty much we can actually collect survey data from these youth and some non-invasive biomarkers by saliva or hair, those who are under 18, and we can get a waiver of parental consent. But we're not able to collect some other measures that might be available through blood, or engage in some other interventions based upon their age, even though, and some of that is just primarily they're not seen as emancipated minors in Ohio. And so it limits about what kind of I guess I want to say kind of like what kind of research and how invasive perhaps maybe we would be engaging with research with them, but it limits then our understanding of their experience and how that may be, their experiences may be impacting their health and well-being. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So thank you so much. There's like so many interesting threads that I hope that we can talk about. To the audience out there, there's been questions about citations. We will have a list of citations and references posted on the CHV website. And please ask questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to start some questions for the participants, and then we'll ask questions that come from the audience. You know, it's really interesting. I mean, there's so many threads. One of them is this sort of like institutional challenges that make it more difficult to engage equitably between researchers and research participants. Also, the way in which the uniformity of research protocols is experienced differently for different participants based on their sort of levels of power and capacity to make use of both the resources and also of the research outcomes once the research has been conducted. And then also one really interesting, I think, point that Rosanne brought up is just when we think often about community engaged research, we think about it as this sort of like hegemonic block, like there's the community and there's the researchers and they have to talk to each other. And one of the things that I think is like really nicely outlined in Rosanne in your research and in the way you're thinking about it is like, it's sometimes very messy, right? And there's just like community is not necessarily one group of people, there's communities within communities, and we have to really think about how to treat participants equitably when there are real disagreements about research priorities. So with all those like interesting threads, let's sort of get the ball rolling and sort of talk about the forces that you see as like the underlying forces that you see as driving some of these power hierarchies. So, you know, by their very structure, the relationships between researchers and research participants are often marked by these deep power imbalances. What are the sort of underlying forces that are driving these power imbalances? And can you give me an example or two of things that you've tried to do in your own work to try and sort of address these power dynamics that sometimes are beyond your immediate control as an individual researcher? And I open this question up for anybody. If there's no takers, I might start calling on people.
So I can just get us started, get the ball rolling. I mean, I think the driving forces are the same ones that are just in society, you know, writ large. I think so. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to the last question that asked about I think the dynamics of like the academic institution and the structural features that kind of prevent or hinder some more collaborative approaches. And I think that one of the driving forces is the fact that we oftentimes are, you know, not always, but oftentimes people who want to take a more collaborative approach toward research are assistant professors who don't have tenure, right? And there is the very, very real requirement to publish, right? And to publish in these peer-reviewed journals or a book, depending on your discipline, right? That really does not lend itself to this collaborative approach. You know, so one of the things that I have written about in the article was just the way in which it required, and it was a quote from, I forget who, I think her name is Culhane is the last name, but she talks about how when you are approaching these research dynamics and with the desire to be more egalitarian, that you need to seek control of what that final product is going to be, right? And so the quote says, to be in a more egalitarian relationship with research subjects necessarily means ceding control of the text. It means subordinating products and mainstream anthropology. And she said the book, the film, the play, and I included the dissertation, right? To the ultimate goal of cultivating more equal power relations. And, you know, really when it came down to it, though, for me, you know, I mean, in addition to the fact that I really wanted to remain committed to some of the things that the Black moms told me, but I was not able to address a lot of the concerns of board members because I wanted to graduate. You know, I wanted my dissertation to be sufficiently critical. And so I think that there is sort of this oftentimes, you know, mismatch in which some of the, you know, the requirements of the institution, the things that you get judged and assessed by is not how equal the power relations are, right, in your research project. It's what the product is, right? And that there are some very particular dimensions and measurements, right, for determining and assessing whether or not you cut it as an academic, right? And that is oftentimes at odds, I think, with cultivating more equal power relations. And then I guess I'll just say, though, that there are ways in which you can, you know, so while I did do the dissertation, write the dissertation the way, you know, with, I think, some feedback, I also, you know, created a film for the school, right? And in the project that I'm doing now, like I am writing a book that's going to be published by an academic press, but I also wrote a bunch of op-eds for people, right? And I also made, you know, a short film for people. And I don't know if some of this just doesn't get talked about, especially when it comes to ethnographic research, because maybe that is just sort of like the price of doing business in some ways, but oftentimes people don't talk about those, what I call ethnographic backstage dynamics. And so, you know, maybe it's more common than one would think, but, you know, I think that there is a way in which you can maybe work towards doing the things you need to make tenure, but also, you know, also cultivate more egalitarian research relationships.
Yeah, I can add that, you know, in my view, the driver of these power imbalances is our egos. It really is our egos. And this goes back to, I think, a question that, or a question I wrote down in response to what Roseann said, and maybe Roseann, you can say a little bit more about this. So it was, how personal experiences influence the choices that we make in the research enterprise, and how our lived experience that we ourselves have, allow us to choose one or the other. As an assistant professor who goes up for tenure this year, that's the stuff that's kept me up all night. Everything else, Rosanne, that you just mentioned about that. But I'm wondering if you have, thought about how do you keep that personal experience and that navigate that identity of the personal and the professional, or don't, and kind of just let things go. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe it's not a bad thing, right? But even with all of the obstacles and the challenges that I encountered in my dissertation study, I just couldn't help being that type of ethnographer, even for the second project, like knowing everything that I knew, right? Like, and one of my, dissertation committee members said, like, I think, during this meeting that I had with some of the board members where they were present, and I was like, oh my gosh, all of my friends are just defending their dissertation without any fanfare. I really wish I had just gone that route and not, was not as collaborative, was not like as concerned about feedback and incorporating their feedback. And she said, that's not who you are as an ethnographer. And I was like, you know what, that's right. Like, I don't know the ins and outs, right? And it's that this process isn't always completely transparent, but I do feel like maybe part of me, and also maybe, and this is like larger than just being an ethnographer, being an academic, right? And me inhabiting this space just means doing things differently, right? And I think maybe in part, it speaks to Toni Morrison's quote also, right? That like, there is this lived experience, right, that informs that approach, right? And with that said, I think, some of the point of like my intro was that is important, right? But it also doesn't necessarily mean that it's smooth sailing after that, right? Even when you have the best intentions, and even when you have some lived experience that makes you want to approach things differently.
And Jodi, do you want to sort of add to questions related to just sort of what are the driving forces in your own work that sort of lead to these hierarchies, and how do you try and negotiate some of the ways in which these power dynamics are not, there's something that are beyond your immediate control in like making things a little bit more equitable?
Sure. I think, it's very interesting listening to Ayaz and Roseann, with also to trying to navigate some of these things as an assistant professor and in your own kind of power dynamic in making your way through tenure and engaging in community engaged or community participatory work, and the length of time that it takes to actually be able to do the work in the way that you're intending to do the work, and meaning for the full principles of engaging in that type of research. And it takes much longer and is much more intensive work to do it, and to do it well. And so it is, I think, a dynamic that is is continually, I think, being discussed and worked on with going through the tenure process with those who are in kind of the role of the power over the researcher. And I would say in my work now, since I have the advantage of being of tenured, you do get some more opportunity to be able to feel that you can go out on and be more of a voiceful advocate for things that you feel kind of passionate about, and that there's obviously still some dynamics as an associate, but you do, I feel like you can take a little bit more risk in what you're engaging in, and I think it goes back to just really in your own mind of why you're doing the research and what's the purpose of doing the research? And it's about equity, and that's what you're wanting to do, and have these people's voices and experiences heard, and trying to remove some of the barriers for them, and I think just kind of keeping that in your own mind, I think, is helpful to help you move forward and trying to navigate some of these, but also ensuring that you have the voice of the participants, that it's not just you going. I think Roseann talked about having the good intent. Just having good intentions is not going to cut it. There's a lot more that's involved in part of that process. So.
I mean, one thing that I hear from all three of you that I think is really important is actually the importance of like the lived experience and the perspective of the researcher. Like, I mean, you could call it ego, but like, you could also call it like, you know, the researcher has, you know, you as a researcher have your methods and your interest in conducting the research on your own terms. And I mean, in some ways it seems like, I mean, one thing to just highlight, I love that Ayaz talked about non-domination or anti-domination as a value, as a way of thinking about equity, right? Anti-domination doesn't necessarily take away the fact that people have these different power dynamics. It just ensures that given the sort of landscape of power hierarchies, people aren't dominating each other when conducting research, right? And so I think that's so interesting and also obviously very challenging. And I mean, so this is going to sort of segue into another question. And audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those up in the Q&A at the bottom. But you, as researchers, we come in with our own motivations and interests and research priorities. Roseann, I think your story really highlights the fact that different stakeholders are interested in participating in research and collaborating from very different, very different motivations. And that's just part of research. That's a good thing, right? And so one question is just sort of, have you ever experienced a situation where there was a clear disagreement between the researchers and research participants, maybe between different research participants, about either the study priorities or the study findings? And if so, how do you navigate those sorts of disagreements? And were there any lessons learned moving forward, if you feel like you could have navigated them better? And maybe I'll start with Roseann, and then we'll go to Ayaz and Jodi.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, my example really speaks to that fact, right? I initiated the process with really good intentions and thinking that I was already being really collaborative because I was working with the principal around the question, right? And then, you know, and had already started collecting data around that. I mean, really was like towards the end of that process, right? And then once some of the findings or some of the things that the Black families told me came out and was relayed to, or wrote up and was relayed to the board members, they really were unhappy about it, right? And they didn't want all of that stuff to be out in the open, right? For a lot of various reasons. And I think that the way that I approached it, I don't know if this is necessarily like something that is applicable to other people, right? But the way that I approached it, which is actually the way that I approach a lot of things, right, is to just try to be as honest, as transparent as possible about it, right? And there were ways in which like I felt very embarrassed as an ethnographer because I felt like I had done something wrong, right? And you know, I was a graduate student too, and I felt like I had gone about that process completely wrong. But I think, you know, like especially with the help of my committee members, and one of my committee members who really writes a lot about these things, you know, he would keep telling me, he would draw this like line with his fingers, and he kept reminding me, like, ethnography is more than just this, right? Like, and he would draw these ever winding circles. And so I think the point of him saying that was just to remind me that, you know, the things that we often think are not part of the ethnographic process are still actually part of the ethnographic process. And there's a lot to be learned in that, you know, and I think so my way of, I guess, addressing it was writing an article that talked about their disagreements with me, right? And making that whole backstage process really transparent. Because ethnographers and anthropologists oftentimes give a lot of lip service to the fact that our representations are one rendering, not the rendering. And there's, a whole politics around representation and all of that, But, but when it comes down to it, oftentimes it's like the final book is the final book, right? And so I guess I'm trying to write the article and writing about all of these disagreements and conflicts that we had. It was really an attempt to show in a very kind of illustrative way, right? That, yeah, these were also people who are trained as anthropologists, right? They really disagree with the things that I said, and I'm just going to be honest and open about it, right? And they have their, way of thinking about it and way of representing their school, and I have my way of representing the school, and these are the things that these are the ways in which they disagreed with me. And so just making that whole entire kind of backstage process transparent, I think, was one way of trying to attenuate some of those power relations, right? And I think with that said, also, again, and I think a lot of people maybe recognize this, but there were organizers. And so, and the board members oftentimes have more power, more connections, right? And so when they actually came to address, some of the things that they disagree with, they knew exactly what channels to go through, right? They knew about the IRB process. They knew to call on the Penn's IRB, right, to ask about my application. And so, so I think, just in thinking about power relations, it's not always that in this case, I feel like it was kind of a draw, but it's not always. The assumption is that the researcher has more power, which is true in a lot of cases. And I think we need to be especially important about understanding those power dynamics. But there are ways in which, that's not always the case. And we just need to kind of, I guess, not do a sloppy job in assuming some of those power dynamics.
Yeah, I think I'll just give you a brief example. So we had some work where we were working with about 10 to 15 individuals from the community, and we asked them to develop what's called a causal loop diagram. So it's a diagram. Think about a concept map, right? But with arrows that show directionality and positive or negative influences. So 3 groups, we split them up into 3 groups. They all created their own causal loop diagram, and when we went to combine these causal loop diagrams into a single one, we got feedback that we were being dishonest to the community engagement process, that we were not honoring the variables, the factors, the relationships that they were bringing from their lived experience into the research enterprise. And so we looked at that and we thought, well, this is going to get really complicated if we try to bring everything into this model. But we did it. We did it because it was our responsibility to honor their lived experience. And what that led to is a reframing by us as researchers to say, maybe this project is no longer about hypothesis testing, but about hypothesis generation. That these relationships, these new ones that they're bringing about are to generate new hypotheses, which is part of science as well, right? So we were able to remain true to what we were doing as scientists, but also remain true to what the community was asking us to do. So I think that's how we've been able to resolve some of those disagreements that have come up in that one case.
Mm.
And Jodi, do you have anything to add?
No, I think I'm good. Thank you.
So, so there's one question in the Q&A from Mark Moritz about writing the backstory. Mark wanted to know if you got input from the stakeholders to write the sort of methodological paper about the backstory.
Yeah.
And there's only like 5 minutes left. So one other question. So I'm going to double questions. So, I mean, one thing that that has come up a lot, especially with this discussion about tenure and assistant professors, and then also graduate students, is we've been thinking about the power hierarchy as being one-dimensional, But often when it comes to, especially this sort of community engaged work and thinking about policy, there are going to be some stakeholders that have a lot of power, especially over junior researchers. So I was just, wanting to know what you thought about whether there are any institutional things that could protect junior researchers or could sort of like help junior researchers negotiate those power dynamics when the researchers are on the sort of lower power level of the relationship in a way that could undermine the integrity of their research.
Mhm.
So Roseann, why don't you go first?
Okay.
The first question, and then
Yeah.
answer the second question.
Oh, okay. So, so what's on my mind is the second question, and then I'll answer the first. So the short answer is just giving us tenure, because honestly, in this book that I'm writing, there are going to be a lot of people like that are probably going to be unhappy with me also, like that are. So the second project that I did was more of a studying up project, right? So it wasn't, I guess the Toni Morrison quote talks a little bit about this also, right? That there, if we want to understand like power and inequality in society, right? It's not just, it shouldn't always just be the study of people who are at the bottom of the social hierarchy, right? And that if we really want to understand why these structural inequalities continue to get perpetuated, right? You have to actually understand who the decision makers are, right? And how they're making these decisions and what structures allow them to continue to perpetuate, in my case, right? These inequalities, these race-based inequalities in school funding. And so, part of that for me was studying like a bunch of policymakers and people who are doing advocacy work. And if I don't get tenure, like I am not going to be able to work at any of those organizations in the future at all, right? And I don't think, and again, so this speaks a little bit also, I think, to what we owe to people who are either our equals or maybe, above us. And so I did feel like even when the people that you're writing about have more power than you, I still felt like there was a way in which I needed to be fair about the things that they said, right? And so that, with the participants who I, actually have a relationship with, like I took a lot of their feedback into account, and we'll be revising some things, right? Just to be fair, right? Even if kind of ultimately the analysis is still the same, right? Because it does point to a lot of really, problematic practices and structures, right? And I don't feel like I don't want to compromise on my critiques of that, right? I do feel like just doing ethnographic work that is so in some ways like personal and revealing sometimes, like, and it represents people, like I feel some responsibility of at least being fair. And then the answer to the question, I guess, which is not up anymore, is no, I didn't end up seeking out the participants. A lot of that article was kind of, it was for myself really to work out a lot of the turmoil that I had over that period of time and kind of needing to reckon with the facts. So I didn't end up publishing my first book based on my dissertation because of a lot of that, the turmoil that went on. And so writing that article was, I guess I tried to attenuate in some way or work towards something that was more egalitarian, but it was also clear that even 3 years after that process had happened, they reached out to one of my dissertation members and said they were still basically mad, and so it was really, it was not, years had not really resolved some of those issues. And so I didn't really feel like it was something that that would be productive, reopening that or trying to do something that was kind of like co-written. It was really kind of more of a process for me to work out some of the issues, right, of that period in my life.
So I'm Ayaz, I think you are typing up an answer. There was one final answer about systems modeling, which I think in general is like an interesting ethical, like research methodological question in itself. So maybe we should have a future session on that as well. And I just really appreciate Rosanne, Jodi, and Ayaz coming today. These discussions are always a little bit too short, and sometimes they open up more questions than answers. But I really do appreciate you giving us this space and also like being earnest about some of these challenges that you've faced in the field, because these are some of the harder questions to talk about. And hopefully, yeah, we could continue the conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you for our final one in a few weeks, I believe.